Shawano County today, the man accused of shooting and killing a man went before a judge.
And our Blake Boris was in the courtroom today where Brent Hofman made his first appearance.
3 glasses of whiskey, half-melted ice, a pistol resting on a homemade bar as if it belonged there, and 2 men who would remember every second of what happened next for the rest of their lives. When deputies finally stepped into that garage in rural Wisconsin, they found a scene that made no sense. 1 man lying face down near a television, gone. A second man barricaded inside the house next door, rifle in hand, refusing to come out until he knew help had arrived. And a third man standing outside in the cold night air, blood running down his face, calmly telling an officer that he loved him. 3 neighbors, 3 friends, no history of conflict between them, no warning signs anyone could point to, just an ordinary evening of hunting talk and whiskey that ended in gunfire, and a mystery that even now no one can explain. Before we go any further, if stories like this one keep you up at night wondering how ordinary evenings can turn into nightmares, do us a favor, tap that like button, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and hit subscribe to Cold Tape Stories right now, because we cover real cases just like this one every week. This is the story of Brent Hofman, and the night 3 old friends sat down for a drink that none of them would walk away from unchanged. To understand what happened, you first have to understand the place where it happened. In the small, rural community of Germania, Wisconsin, a man named Rick Roundy had spent years building something he was proud of. Alongside a lifelong friend named John Sumagon, Rick had constructed a property that became more than just a house. It was a gathering place. Families came together there for holidays. It served as a base camp for hunting trips, the kind of land where men could sit around a fire, talk about the deer they'd tracked that day, and forget about the outside world for a while. Rick himself was born on the 9th of October 1958. By the time these events unfolded, he had been married to his high school sweetheart, Diane, for 41 years. Together they had raised 3 children, Adam, Megan, and Jacob. Rick had retired 8 years ago, and retirement had given him the freedom to pour himself into the things he cared about most. He and Diane became deeply involved in their local church, chairing charity auctions together and helping organize the annual school raffle. By all accounts, they were the kind of couple who quietly made their community better. And in the days leading up to what happened, Rick had just become a grandparent for the very first time at the age of 67. On the 22nd of November 2025, Wisconsin's deer hunting season was set to open. So many other men across the state, Rick made his way out to the property to prepare for the season ahead. 2 neighbors would join him there, one whose identity has never been made public and who we will refer to as Paul, was 65 years old. The other was a man named Brent Hofman, 74 years old, born in 1950. Brent stood around 5 feet 7 inches tall, with blue eyes and brown hair. Both Rick and Paul thought of him as something of a loner, a quiet man who kept mostly to himself. But they liked him. He was part of their circle, part of the rhythm of that land, and neither of them had any reason to fear him. On Wednesday, the 12th of November 2025, at around 6 o'clock in the evening, Paul made his way over to Rick's property. Brent was already there, waiting in the garage with Rick, and he had brought along something he often carried with him, a pistol tucked into a holster. The 3 men settled in for what looked like any other evening among old friends. They poured whiskey, they talked about the upcoming season, about the deer they hoped to find, about nothing in particular. It was the kind of low, easy conversation that happens 1,000 times a year in garages just like that one across rural America. At some point during the evening, Brent reached down, drew the handgun from its holster, and set it on the bar in front of him. Paul would later insist there was nothing threatening in the gesture. It wasn't aggressive, it wasn't a warning, it was simply something Brent did, and the other two barely reacted. The weapon was a 9mm Smith & Wesson CSX, and for a while it just sat there beside the whiskey glasses, unremarkable. All three men were drinking that night, but Paul noticed that Brent was going through his glass far faster than either he or Rick. It stood out to him even in the moment, though it didn't strike him as anything dangerous, just a man drinking a little too quickly on a cold November evening. For nearly 3 hours, nothing about the night felt unusual. The conversation kept flowing, the whiskey kept pouring. And then, somewhere inside those 3 hours, something in Brent began to shift. He started talking strangely. His words didn't track the way they had all evening, and then he said something that neither Rick nor Paul could have prepared for. He began speaking about having to kill people, as though it were something forced upon him, something outside of his control. Moments later, he picked the pistol back up off the bar. For a second, the other two assumed he might simply be leaving for the night. Instead, Brent turned to face them and said the words that would end that evening forever. He told them he hoped they would excuse him because he had to kill them. It was the tone more than anything that unsettled Rick. This wasn't how Brent spoke. This wasn't the man they'd known for years. So Rick walked around the bar toward Brent, concern written across his face, and asked if he was all right. That single act of compassion was met with gunfire. Brent raised the pistol and began firing directly into Rick, who collapsed to the floor almost instantly. As he went down, Paul called out to Rick, a final warning, a final act of looking out for his friend, even as his own life was slipping away. Paul didn't hesitate. The moment he saw the gun rise, he dove for cover, and then he ran. He sprinted out through the garage's service door and crossed the short stretch of ground, less than 10 feet, that separated the garage from Rick's house. He made it inside and locked the door behind him, his heart pounding, with no idea if his friend Rick was alive or dead. What he did know, with terrifying clarity, was that Brent was still out there, and he was still armed. Inside the house, Paul found a scoped Ruger .22 caliber rifle. He loaded it with shaking hands and positioned himself near an ottoman facing the south door, the door he expected Brent to come through. Somehow, in the middle of all of it, he found enough composure to pick up his phone and call 911. The call came into dispatch at around 9:15 that night. Paul told the dispatcher that Brent had shot his friend with a pistol and that he had no way of knowing if Rick was still alive. He described Brent to the dispatcher, an older man with a beard, wearing a leather hat. He explained that he had armed himself inside the house, that he feared for his life, and that if Brent tried to force his way inside, he was prepared to defend himself. The dispatcher stayed on the line as the situation unfolded in real time. At around 9:20, Paul reported that he could see Brent near one of the windows. He moved carefully around the room, trying to stay out of any direct line of sight. Then Brent began trying the doors, testing them, searching for a way in. For Paul, trapped inside with a rifle and a phone line to a stranger 100 miles away, it must have felt like the walls themselves were closing in. And then, for one brief moment, Paul had a clear shot. He raised the rifle, lined up the scope through a glass door and aimed at Brent's head. At 9:21, he fired. The glass shattered, and Brent fell backward out of sight. For a moment, Paul believed it might be over, but roughly 15 seconds later, Brent rose back into view through the broken frame. Paul fired again. This time, the shot missed its mark, but the glass exploding around Brent's face tore his skin open in a series of deep cuts, wounds that would later be visible to every officer on scene. By 9:22, Paul told the dispatcher he was reloading. A few minutes after that, he reported that Brent had gone down and appeared to be lying on the ground. At the time, he genuinely believed he might have killed him. In reality, Brent was still alive, simply lying low, waiting.
It would take another 10 minutes before help physically arrived. Deputy Austin Manders was the first officer on scene, and what he found immediately complicated the picture Paul had described. The man he encountered was wearing a cowboy-style hat, not the leather hat Paul had mentioned in his call. For a brief, disorienting moment, there was uncertainty about who this man even was. Manders ordered him to the ground, but the man didn't comply right away. Instead, he stood there, telling the deputy that his body hurt everywhere, before finally collapsing. It was Brent. His face and head were covered in cuts from the shattered glass, blood visible in the dark. In a slurred, half-conscious state, he told Manders that he was sorry. When the deputy asked where his gun was, Brent said he didn't have one. Then he corrected himself. He had a holster, he said, but the gun itself was gone. A search of the immediate area turned up no firearm, only a wallet that confirmed his identity. And then, in one of the most unsettling details of the entire night, Brent thanked the deputy. He told him that he loved him. Manders noted the overwhelming smell of alcohol, the slurred and disjointed speech. When he asked where the other man was, Brent silently pointed toward the garage, and then he began to cry. Manders looked inside and saw Rick lying face down on the floor. He asked Brent who it was. Brent answered in a broken voice that it was his friend Rick, and that he thought he was dead. Moments later, in what may be the strangest exchange of the entire night, Brent turned to the deputy and asked him why he had shot him. Manders, confused, told him plainly that he had not fired a single shot. Brent, by this point, was clearly delirious, caught somewhere between the violence he had caused and the violence that had been done to him in return. Manders moved to check on Rick. There was no pulse, no signs of life. Paramedics arrived shortly after and confirmed what the deputy already suspected. Rick Roundy was gone. Other officers began clearing the scene, and inside the garage they found a black handgun resting on the bar, exactly where the night's events had first turned violent. They cleared the house next and found Paul still inside, shaken but alive. He was searched and placed in the back of a patrol car, not under arrest, but detained while investigators worked to secure and understand the scene. If you're still with us at this point, drop a comment saying, "I'm still here." I'd genuinely love to know how many of you are piecing together every detail of the case right alongside us. And if you're finding this story as gripping as we did putting it together, take a second to like this video and subscribe to Cold Tape Stories, because there's a lot more of this investigation still to come. Detective Craig Rakowski arrived at the property at around 10:17 that night to take over the investigation. He spoke with Paul first, and Paul told him everything, calmly and in full, saying he had witnessed the entire event and was willing to answer whatever questions were needed. When Rakowski examined the crime scene itself, the details painted a strange, almost eerie picture. The 3 whiskey glasses were still sitting on the bar, untouched since the shooting began. A pool of blood had spread just west of the television, and yet there were no signs of any struggle anywhere in the room. The chairs stood upright. Papers on a nearby table sat completely undisturbed, as though the violence had erupted out of nowhere, with no physical fight preceding it at all.
Investigators recovered 3 spent 9mm shell casings from the garage floor. One was found near where Rick's body lay. The other 2 were discovered near a chair, consistent with the gunfire Paul had described. Every detail Paul gave investigators matched precisely with the physical evidence at the scene. Meanwhile, Brent was transported by ambulance to the hospital for treatment of his injuries. Even in his disoriented state, he reportedly asked along the way whether his friends were okay, a question that sits uneasily alongside everything else he had just done. At the hospital, he agreed to provide a voluntary blood sample, which was collected and sealed into evidence. The results of that test have never been made public, though many watching this case have wondered just how intoxicated Brent was that night, and whether alcohol played any role in what happened. Once he was medically cleared, Brent was formally booked into jail. When staff informed him he was being booked on suspicion of homicide, he responded simply saying he had never hurt anybody. It's a chilling statement given what investigators had already documented at the scene, and it would become one of several strange, contradictory moments that would come to define how the public understood this case. The following day, detectives attempted to interview Brent directly. He requested a lawyer, a right afforded to every person in his position, and the formal interview ended there. What limited account he did give investigators was fragmented at best. He told them he remembered the night clearly up until his second drink, and after that, according to him, there was nothing. Rick's autopsy was conducted on the 14th of November. The findings confirmed 3 gunshot wounds, 1 to the chest, 1 to the underarm area, 1 to the left wrist, likely sustained as he tried to defend himself in those final seconds. On the 18th of November 2025, prosecutors formally charged Brent Hofman with first-degree intentional homicide for the killing of Rick Roundy, along with attempted first-degree intentional homicide for the attack on Paul. The homicide charge alone carried the possibility of a mandatory life sentence, with parole not even being a possibility until at least 20 years had been served. At his first court appearance, the district attorney requested a cash bond of $1 million, describing the shooting in stark terms as a killing carried out in cold blood. Because it was ordered as a cash bond rather than a signed bond, Brent would not be eligible for release unless the entire sum was paid outright. The court also barred him from any contact with Rick's family or with Paul, and should he ever post bond, he would be required to remain completely sober, avoid all illegal substances, surrender any access to firearms, and stay within the state of Wisconsin at all times. Months passed as the legal process moved forward. On the 27th of January 2026, a judge determined there was sufficient evidence at a preliminary hearing to send the case to a full criminal trial. Then, on the 21st of May 2026, Brent Hofman stood before the court and pleaded not guilty to both charges. As it stands, no trial date has yet been set, and Brent remains held in county jail while the case continues to move through the system. Alongside the criminal case, Rick's widow, Diane, has filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Brent. That civil case, running parallel to the criminal proceedings, is also still ongoing, another chapter of this story still waiting to be written. In the days following Rick's death, the family made the difficult decision to confirm his identity publicly after early news reports had described him only as a 67-year-old man from the Greenleaf area. In a statement released to the community, the family said they were devastated and heartbroken by the sudden loss, and they thanked everyone who had reached out in support before asking, gently, for privacy as they grieved. Rick was laid to rest on the 18th of November. In lieu of traditional gifts, the family asked that any memorial contributions be directed to the parish where Rick and Diane had spent so many years volunteering together. And in perhaps the most striking detail of this entire case, Rick's obituary included a request that many found almost impossible to reconcile with the violence of his death. It asked readers to pray not only for Rick's grieving family, family, but for the man responsible for his death. It also asked for prayers on behalf of anyone struggling silently with their own mental health, a reflection, it seems, of the deep faith that had defined Rick and Diane's life together for over 40 decades. Paul, to this day, has not given any public interview about that night. His identity remains protected, and everything we know about those terrifying hours inside that house comes from the account he gave investigators in the immediate aftermath, an account that point for point matched exactly what detectives found at the scene. For years, Rick and his family had called that stretch of land God's country, a place of holidays and hunting trips and quiet evenings among friends. In a single night in November of 2025, it became something else entirely, the place where Rick Roundy's life ended at the hands of a man he had known and trusted for years. What remains is a question that may never be fully answered. 3 men who had spent years as neighbors and friends, sharing a bottle of whiskey and easy conversation about deer season, watched that evening dissolve into violence with no argument, no history of conflict, nothing in the years before that night to explain what happened inside that garage. Whether the courts will ever be able to determine full legal responsibility remains to be seen. What's clear is that Brent Hofman, by every account since that night, has seemed like a deeply unwell man, one whose own memory of the event stops cold after his second drink. Perhaps the most unsettling part of this entire case is that even Brent himself may never be able to explain what happened. And so the people left behind, a widow of 41 years, 3 grieving children, a community that once called that land sacred, are left to carry a tragedy that offers no clean answers, only the quiet, aching hope that Rick's family expressed in his own obituary.
A hope for peace, for understanding, and for grace, even in the face of something this senseless. So tell us, do you think we'll ever really know why? If you've got a theory about what really happened inside that garage, drop it in the comments. We read every single one. And if this is the kind of story that keeps you scrolling at 2 in the morning, you already know what to do. Subscribe to Cold Tape Stories now, because the next unsolved mystery is closer than you think.